Hello and welcome to Season 2 of Inside the Therapy Room. I'm your host, Sam Sellers. I'm a registered therapist, a wife and a fur mama, and I am passionate about breaking down the barriers and stigma attached to therapy. I want to begin by first honouring the traditional custodians of the land we live and work on. Today, Ray is on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and Sam is on Gundungurra land. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions and cultures of our First Nations people. We must always remember that the land below our feet is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. You may notice that this season has more than the usual 10 episodes. That's because Inside the Therapy Room is finishing up. But don't worry, there are still 4 more episodes to come after this. Today I'm chatting to Ray Sabine, who uses they/them pronouns. Ray is an arts therapist, psychotherapist, and supervisor. They are non-binary and neurodivergent with a lived experience of chronic illness, as well as being vegan and loving animals. They are passionate about disability rights, the LGBTQIA+ community, and mental health. They have a sensory garden outside the studio, and when working therapeutically, they use person-centered, strengths-based, and peer support approaches to assist individuals to access their internal resources and build their resilience. Their core values include connection, expression, creativity, imagination, curiosity, authenticity, courage, empowerment, personal congruence, and autonomy. Today's episode is all about the intersection of being queer and neurodivergent. We hope you enjoy joining us inside the therapy room. Welcome, Ray. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I am excited about this episode because I originally reached out to you in terms of your work with neurodivergent folk, but you came back with me countering with I guess, more niche intersection of queer people who are also neurodivergent. So I thought we would let's start with maybe just defining those two terms. So what is queer?
Mm. Well, I think with both those terms, they're different experiences to what we perceive as normal or typical, or I guess often cis het is seen as the default, isn't it? Or neurotypical is the default. Therefore, when we're looking at queer people that have queer experiences of life, whether that's gender, sexuality, or maybe even a lack of those things.
Yeah. And so I guess for people who maybe don't know, when we say cis het, we are talking about, so cis meaning cisgender in terms of
Not trans.
people, yes, that people who I guess
they feel comfortable with the gender they are assigned at birth.
yes.
It's definitely
Yes.
not a slur. I think sometimes people get a bit offended when they hear the word,
Yeah.
but it just means you're not trans. It means you haven't gone through a process of realizing what you were assigned at birth does not fit you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And het meaning heterosexual, which I think most people will know, that you are attracted to somebody of the opposite sex. And in terms of neurotypical, we, I guess, are referring to anything that is not neurodivergent.
Yes.
So when we use the term neurodivergent, what are we talking about?
Neurodivergence is such a wide umbrella. I think often people think it's just autism or ADHD, but it's really any experience that maybe you're learning, behavior, thinking, is different to the norm. It doesn't mean that you're disordered or defected. It's really about, having an identity that you understand diverges from what is typical.
I love that. And I think it is much bigger umbrella than people realize, right?
Oh,
It
yes,
is,
definitely.
it spans, and I mean, even when we talk about ADHD and autism, those in themselves are humongous spectrums, as well. So that I find, I mean, the queer umbrella is quite large, but the neurodivergent umbrella is probably even bigger, in terms of
Yes.
what falls under that. Um, why is this, I guess, before we get into the nitty-gritty about it, why is this something that you landed yourself working in? Why is it an area you're passionate about?
Well, I guess, I am queer and neurodivergent myself.
Mhm.
I worked in some clinics where I was told to hide those aspects of myself, which I
Mm,
found very hard being a person that uses they, them pronouns. It's not like, I guess with my sexuality, that doesn't always come up in
mhm,
conversation, but yeah, being misgendered and not letting people know that, yeah, their view of me is not correct felt really
mhm,
inauthentic. And so I just decided to start my own private practice where I'd be out and found there are so many queer neurodivergent people who are seeking that lived experience,
mm.
and have an experience of being othered by therapists that often, are very well meaning, but just do not understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if I go back to the time when I was studying, self-disclosure is such a no-no in terms of like you just don't do it. But I think we are now sort of gone are the days of that stone cold no reaction therapy that we sometimes were taught or we see on TV or in movies and things like that. Because I know for myself, seeking out a therapist that had lived experience was important for me.
Yeah.
And I think in certain subsects like queerness, neurodivergence, I find even in my own specialization of religious trauma, it is the same thing. And I think sometimes it boils down to I don't want to educate my therapist. And
I
that's
feel like in
important.
my training, like as an
Mhm.
art therapist, I was actually really privileged to learn that lived experience is like
Yeah.
valuable. And we actually didn't call ourselves therapists, we were companions.
Mm,
And it was really about like the relationship and not having like a hierarchical structure. But
yeah.
when I went into the therapeutic world and into clinics and working spaces, it was quite clear to me that um, you know, my managers or bosses and things had a very different attitude, and they came probably from your
Mm.
similar training, that you were a blank canvas, and you do not bring in lived experience. Yeah.
Yeah, that extreme version of neutrality, which
Mm.
just, we are just as human as the people we are sitting with in the room. So I think that's always important.
And I feel you
Um,
too, like if I went and saw a therapist and I was going through, yeah, maybe exploring my sense of self, I would want to know they've been on a similar path, even if it was maybe for them more about, yeah, coming to terms with their, I don't know, a different identity. I just want
yeah.
to know that what I'm saying doesn't sound strange.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think sometimes it's just coming back to the fact that you want to know that your therapist has sat in the client seat at
Yes.
some point. That's
Yeah.
kind of what it comes back to. Um, Okay, what sort of actually we might go with I might jump a couple of questions while we're talking about therapy because this might be a good point to talk about what affirming, like queer and neurodivergent affirming therapy actually looks like. What if there are therapists listening, what are some of the things that they should be looking at to go, how do I make sure that actually what I'm doing is affirming for this part of the community?
Great question. And yeah, I think it really comes down to like, okay, if we're thinking about, neurodivergent people and wanting to be neuroaffirming, you cannot hold a pathologizing DSM framework with that. You can't use any words like defect or disorder or things like that. That is so far removed from being affirming. And yeah, I think it's similar to the queer community. You can't bring conversion therapy into a queer affirming space. They're completely different things. But
Mhm.
yet, I think in the neurodivergent world, therapists have not quite caught up with that, and they think they can combine
Mm.
a bit of both.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I even as you say that I have like a visceral reaction to when conversion practices are called conversion therapy, because it's not therapy, it's abuse. And so I think it is a matter of like you can't combine something that sees a human as defective or, like you said, disordered, and think that that's going to be therapeutic or beneficial for them. Are there things that are like, often when we talk about, like often this term it comes up with racism, but I find it comes up with ableism and, queer and transphobia and things like that, of microaggressions. And I guess the first thing that pops into my mind, which is probably more related to the queer community, but things like asking someone what their preferred pronouns are,
Oh,
as
I
opposed
hate
to
that word
what,
preferred.
yeah, like
Yeah.
it sort of, it doesn't, on the surface, it doesn't sound bad, but the underpinning is that, this is not just a core part of who they are and of their identity. It's something that they've chosen. It's something that, it's just a preference. Like in the,
Yeah, yeah.
I prefer cornflakes over
No.
Wheaties. Like it's not about that, right?
Yeah.
So are there things that therapists need to maybe be aware of in terms of the language that they use?
Yeah, I think it's to go a little bit deeper than language, even something that I constantly hear people I work with say to me is I had my therapist tie my sexual assault to why I want to transition, and there's so much data out there to show the reason why violence and these things sort of happen towards queer people is because we internalize these horrible narratives, and it affects the way we move through the world, our body language, our defenses go down, and people looking to assault people look for that sort of body language. And so
Mhm,
yeah, it really has nothing to do with that individual. It's got to do with how society affects that individual. And
mhm,
yeah, I'm always so deeply hurt to hear that's such a common experience for people that yeah, again, it comes back to the therapist thinking cis het's a default, and
mm,
someone's diverged from that, rather than this person may have always been queer, and that's okay. Yeah, it seems,
yeah.
and yet these people can say they're affirming, and I'm just like, that's so
Mhm.
far from being affirming. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, and I use this language in terms of, churches when I talk about churches with my niche, but I guess it's the difference between welcoming and affirming,
Yeah.
because welcoming is probably what you're talking about. In terms of welcoming, people might use language around preferred and might, draw connections between trauma and sexuality or trauma and gender and those sorts of things. But affirming doesn't do that. So because it's affirming of their gender, sexuality, queerness. What about in terms of neurodivergence? Because I know that there is a lot of conversation around, do we use the term autistic? Do we use the term person with autism? What language is affirming language around those who are neurodivergent?
Yes, so I think yeah, a lot of people do prefer to say they're an autistic person, like if you said I have autism, it sounds like I have a headache.
Mm,
It's just like I'm a queer person, not a person with queerness. Like these are
mm,
identities. But of course, these communities are very broad, and people have individual experiences, and it's always good to use the language that the person feels most comfortable with. Um, in the same way, I'd like that reflected back with me too.
yeah.
It's a sign of respect. I think, functioning labels are quite problematic that a lot of therapists still use. Yeah, there's still a lot of um, concepts around forcing people to make eye contact that,
Mhm,
or like, yeah, that we're needing to expose neurodivergent people to situations in order them to get used to their sensory sensitivities, when, you know, a lot of the data shows that is not helpful and it's actually harmful to these people. And yeah, so I think sometimes these therapists have good intentions but don't really assess that, yeah, some of these things are about making the person seem neurotypical and not helping them honor that maybe they can have a conversation like, look, I find eye contact really uncomfortable,
Yeah.
and it does not mean I'm not listening. It does not make me not empathetic.
Mm.
Um, and I hope that's something you can understand. And maybe more and more people will start getting comfortable with different ways of communicating if we encourage individuals have those conversations rather than trying to honor what neurotypicals find comfortable.
Yeah, yeah. And I find that it's so important, I guess, for people in the industry to have these conversations so that our clients are not feeling like they need to have those, like, is this okay with you sort of conversation, because that affirming approach, ideally, you know, in an ideal world, would be the default. You know, I am certainly not, I work obviously with the queer community, but is not somebody who specializes in neurodivergence, but yet I still have like a really gross reaction when I see on people's websites that they work with high functioning autism and things like that. And even, to be honest, even when people say high functioning anxiety, and you know, I think as soon as we put high functioning in front of anything, we've missed the mark.
Yeah.
In terms of the conversation that needs to happen. Um, what are some of the things that those who might be neurodivergent, or you know, whether they have the, and I say might because, you know, the reality is that accessibility and affordability for diagnosis is incredibly difficult. And so, you know, people who might have a formal diagnosis and those who might just have like a suspect that they might
Well, I
be.
think being neurodivergent, you don't need a diagnosis.
Yeah.
Having a diagnosis, that brings us back to the DSM, doesn't it?
Yes.
Being neurodivergent, I guess, like being queer, it's an
Mhm.
identity you can claim. If you feel that your experiences, make you neurodivergent in any way, then you're neurodivergent. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and yeah, I don't think someone else can gatekeep that. It's not like calling yourself an ally. Well, you know, we understand that ally is a term that we would use to describe someone we feel is,
Mm.
doing good in the community.
Yeah.
It's not a self-identity label.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think is a really good point, because I guess diagnosis is a default as well in terms of like even mental health. But you know, I have anxiety. I don't have an anxiety you know, diagnosis. I don't need somebody to tell me that I have anxiety. I know that. And I think, you know, like you said, it's probably high time that we take the same approach. Whilst understanding that obviously, you know, the conversation probably needs to go in that our government is not super great in terms of providing support for those without an official diagnosis, and that sometimes, you know, there does need to be additional supports and things like that put in
Oh,
place in
you
terms of
do need
funding and that
it.
sort of thing.
Yeah, in our society, you definitely need a diagnosis in order to
Yeah.
what you need and stuff. And as someone who works with a lot of NDIS participants, I find it intensely frustrating because the language is so yeah, defective and yeah, deficit based. That's what I meant to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
um
Yeah,
yeah,
I
and
mean,
it's
it's in the
I,
ADHD title, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah.
that word, yeah.
Well, the NDS doesn't even fund ADHD. So yeah,
Oh, oh my
yeah.
goodness, I did not
There's
know that.
medication treated.
Oh,
So
right,
things like
yeah.
bipolar,
Mhm,
ADHD, because there's medications, they often
mhm,
don't fund it unless you're able to prove that you have a long history of that not working. Um,
right.
yeah, and for some people that can take 20 years. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so for those who are neurodivergent, what are some of the things that they should be looking out for if they are looking for a therapist and they're, you know, looking at, you know, tons of different websites, or they're looking at somebody in their own town? What are some of the things that they should look out for in terms of somebody who is queer and neurodivergent affirming?
yeah, I think one great thing is honoring your sensory needs. Like, when I first meet with someone, I check if the lighting is too much, or if there's, I've got a bookshelf I love books, and, want to make sure that, that's covered if they're feeling overwhelmed by that, or I have a sensory garden here. So, we might even, for sensory seekers, go out and have a smell or touch, and just really kind of get a sensory profile in those first few sessions of what this individual needs, so that they feel comfortable. Because if they're feeling overwhelmed by light or something, then that's going to impact the therapy. If I ask a question that might make them feel exposed or vulnerable, then they may shut down or get overwhelmed, or so I want to try and help them with that as much as possible when I first meet them.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what are some of the, if we sort of skip back a couple of questions. I love when episodes just go in their own direction.
It's neurodivergent rabbit hole.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
I
my
was like,
type
we're
of
just
therapy.
rolling with it.
I remember when I
Um,
did my training, we would like learn, person comes into your room, has a presenting issue. By the end of it, you contain it and they leave. I feel like the neurodivergent way is we will go down all these different rabbit holes.
yeah.
Maybe one of them gets put into a box nicely. Maybe they don't. Maybe in 3 sessions times the person leaves with 3 boxes of of their
Oh,
contained
that
content,
yeah, that structure of like presentation, containment, leaving sort of
Yes,
thing.
yeah.
I don't think I have ever had a session go like that, to be honest. I just, that's just like, I guess the difference between theory and reality. Humans just
And you've
don't
got to
work
give
that
people
way.
time to, yeah, exactly. And you've got to give people time to talk about their special interests, or,
Yeah.
give space for those things too. I
Yeah.
think that's really important working with neurodivergent people. I've
Mm.
had individuals say to me that I wanted to talk about sharks and it got shut down. And I was like, you can talk about sharks. Like,
Yeah.
I would love to learn about sharks. Tell me about sharks.
Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
terrified of sharks. So if anybody wants to
Okay.
talk about sharks, go to Ray, not me. Because I'm terrified of sharks. But which is less than ideal because my wife loves them. But that's life. Okay, if we talk about the intersection of, I think most of the time we don't necessarily talk about we talk about queerness and we talk about neurodivergence, but we don't necessarily talk about that intersection of being both in the same human. What are some of the things that might present, or the challenges that might present for this intersection of the community?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, a big thing that often when reflecting on an event that's happened, it can, be hard for individuals to separate if that bullying or microaggression or whatever it was it because I was queer, or was it because I was neurodivergent? Was there a communication difference there, or is it that they picked up on, that, I am attracted to the same gender, or whatever it is for that person. And that can be very hard and confusing to sit with for a lot of people. um
Yeah,
yeah
I
there's
would
so
imagine
much
it would.
othering that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And would cause a lot of the first thing that's sort of coming to mind is like almost frantic thinking about what was that? Like you said, was it the queerness? Was it the neurodivergence? Was it something something completely irrelevant to either of those things? Would cause a lot of anxiety, I would think, as
Mm.
well. Um,
Yes, I see a lot of anxiety. I feel I've had a lifelong experience of anxiety around, how I'm perceived and how others treat me too. So I really feel that in when people share these experiences with me.
yeah, absolutely. And, I guess I often talk about this in terms of queerness and intersectionality, and the more marginalized you are, the more, the further into the margins of society you are, the more difficulties that are faced. And I guess, we think about those who are queer and those who are neurodivergent, who are, I guess, pushing you further out from the stereotypical and the neurotypical in the center of society. Um, does that get brought up in your room in terms of like that suppression, that feeling of otherness, that, how do I fit in to, I guess, mainstream society in inverted commas?
I think I could probably actually see that less in this intersection than if I was just with someone who was queer or if I was just with someone who's neurodivergent. It's
Okay.
almost that is sort of the beauty of this intersection is there are so many multifaceted parts of these people's identity. They've kind of had to accept that and embrace that they are different. And
Mm,
I feel like a lot of people I meet with are ready to have a more affirming approach and they want to move into a space of self-love and
mm,
find community and other people because they're sick of being othered and they're sick of the pressure people put on them to fit in. They know they can't often that they've come to that point where they're like, there's so many differences in me, I can't mask it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And masking is hard, and I would imagine that the more that you have to mask, the more exhausting, and the more, um, like you said, the more it's probably unattainable to even attempt to mask. What are some of the things that people present with in the room for you? What brings this intersection to therapy?
Yes, I think it is often systemic issues.
Mm,
Yeah, navigating a world that is yeah, not um, considering your needs
mm,
and how to be able to advocate for what you need and yeah, really wanting to be able to better understand yourself so you can be able to explain to other people too. I don't feel like these people don't understand themselves. It's just that lack of understanding that comes outwards adds a lot of confusion and anxiety and can make it hard to speak out about your narrative. And so sometimes, through doing art explorations and nonverbal sort of approaches, we can then start telling a verbal narrative, I
yeah,
find. Yeah.
yeah.
And that's what I love about art therapy. Gives you so many different ways of communicating and honoring different ways of different communication styles.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Absolutely. And I find it just makes me think of that joke where it's like people in therapy are in therapy to deal with those who should be in therapy. And it's, sometimes I find that, even working with, people from the queer community, it's like, how can I explain this to my mum or to my sister or, whoever it is? And it's, I guess, trying to have language to explain something to somebody else, even though in an ideal world, again, it would be those people who would be in therapy going, how do I understand this, rather than expecting the person to do the explaining.
Oh, that's so well said. I feel like that took me to a moment of like, well, many moments. Often, after a big session, I might be filled with rage and just have to like put
Mm,
on music and just fist pump down the street because there are so many outside factors I can't control or I
mm,
can't say, well, I might say, but it doesn't go anywhere, that maybe your mum would do well going to therapy and
no,
learning about these sorts of things or yeah, and knowing that's not going to happen. And
yeah.
yeah, and it's very frustrating because I feel that limitation of my role here.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah. And I would imagine there would be a point for the person in your room to have to come to a point of acceptance around that as well, particularly, there is so much, I'm thinking, circles of control and things like that in terms of what you can control and what you can't. And there is a lot that is outside of your control, in terms of how other people view who you are and your identity and different facets of that.
I do really have to kind of do my own gratitude practice around being born in a time where I can be a non-binary neurodivergent therapist, because,
Yeah.
it was, even in my lifetime that, like, when around the time I was born, it was illegal to be queer,
Yeah.
and neurodivergent people were heavily, put through ABA therapies and things like
Yeah.
that. So yeah, I do try and find gratitude in where I am right now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Recognize we have come a long way. We still have a long way to go,
we
but
have so long, and it's so overwhelming and it
yes.
infuriating at times.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I'm gonna throw a curveball at you a little bit because it made me think of, I guess, the idea that we are supposed to keep therapy and politics separate, but in terms of
Mm.
the community you are working with, that's not possible for a lot of those people, right?
Yes, and this is how my Instagram page really came to fruition for me. I started getting very triggered by things in sessions, and I felt very like, these people going through the same things to me, and I don't even know how to address it. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to start making posts about these things and hope that, if I make them kind of simple and accessible, that maybe some people will start
Mm,
getting on board, or learning these things, or wanting to educate others, or even giving terms to describe our experiences,
yeah.
um, which can be empowering. And yeah, so I feel like I've channeled a lot of that frustration into there now. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's really easy for therapists uh, who might fit all of the norms in terms of being a white, cisgender, heterosexual therapist to go, we can't blend politics and therapy. But for the people who are coming into our room, a lot of the time, that's not possible, right? That um, particularly when their identity or parts of their identity are weaponized in policy and in politics, and is being talked about in the news and in things like that. And so it is, I guess, coming back to a very basic premise of therapy, of meeting them where they are at and what they need to talk about. But I think there is this inherent view that we need to keep politics out of the therapy room. But I think that's a privilege not many people are afforded, right?
I also work with a lot of
Yeah,
advocates. Advocates, yes. So, they bring politics into the room.
yeah.
And, I mean, yes, I try to, approach things in ensuring that they're still self-caring while fighting,
Mm,
so that they can continue their, political fights. And,
mm,
um, but yeah, I think especially working with trans people, it is such a political space, and
yeah.
it's not one we've wanted to be made so. But especially with all the things in America that's happening, it's
Mm,
just such a very politically charged topic at the moment, and so it's hard not to have that impact the community. So yeah, they're constantly bringing it to me, and it would be so dismissive of me to say that that is not
mm,
something we can explore. Or
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And so this might be a good transition to, what is it like in your therapy space? What is it like for people who are queer and neurodivergent to be in the room? What happens in the room?
Yeah. Well, I might continue on with the transgender
Yeah.
thread. I find something that a lot of therapists have gone, "Oh, that's interesting. That doesn't really happen." Is that with my transgender, especially teenage clients, they will express to me that they didn't think transgender people made it into adulthood, or
Mm,
that they don't see themselves seeing a picture of them as an adult. And yeah, so we might cry in that first session.
mm,
There may be a lot of grief around that lack of healthy representation, and um, Yeah, and so it is that first session can be quite vulnerable and um, quite sensitive. I think with my neurodivergent um, folks that I work with, yeah, it may be more around, finding the right fidget toy to get comfortable, maybe the right sensory material that they might want to play with, or maybe they want to make slime or
Mm.
something to sort of really get comfortable in the space first before even worrying about getting comfortable with me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
It sounds like there is a lot of consideration in terms of not just what you do in the session, but the environment that you are in for the session.
Yeah. Yes. I do always want to take feedback very seriously, and we'll see if I can make modifications to my room or space, if someone lets me know that, yeah, maybe my light it would give them a headache. Well, I'm going to go get a
Mhm.
lamp, see if that's better, and
Yeah.
um, or open the blinds and see if natural light helps in any way, and
Mm.
ensure that that's not a discomfort they're feeling they need to continue sitting with, because that's what they might have been told at school or other workplaces. Workplaces are horrible with fluorescent lights and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that those sorts of things are not often considered by a lot of therapists because, we get told often to make sure that there's nothing that would be polarizing or triggering in your space and to keep it neutral and, all of those sorts of things. But often, having things in the environment like, the ability to change lighting and the ability to have sensory based things in the room is probably not something that a lot of people have considered about their space. Uh,
Yeah. I know a lot of neurodivergent people tell me they even like art therapy because with talk therapists, they might sit in the room and be staring at the artwork and then at their therapist's eyebrows, and it's a very awkward thing. And I think neurotypical people struggle with eye contact when
mm,
they're vulnerable too. So like
absolutely.
yeah, exactly. So but they'll say to me, like, even if, yeah, they're just free drawing or something, and we're not necessarily doing art therapy, but
Mm,
that ability to draw is like a safe container while we might chat about something vulnerable, and they know there's no pressure from me for
mm,
them to have to look at me, or me accuse them of not listening because they're drawing. I know that was something I got in school a lot, was stop drawing, you have to listen. And then I would just sit there being like, okay, I've got to listen. What's that kid over there doing? Oh my God, I'm not listening. But while I was drawing, I would be able to take so much more in.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think even like, just that innate ability that therapists tend to like things to go in a linear direction.
Oh.
Um, which which is just not, I mean, I find that that's not going to happen with most clients, even if they are neurotypical. But is there a fine line with neurodivergence between, I might pull a client back to something we were talking about if I feel like perhaps, there's a point of avoidance or, something like that. But is there a fine line between pulling a client back to something that they were talking about, and just recognizing that that's a part of who they are in that, exploring things in a non-linear fashion is part of their neurodivergence?
I think, it doesn't hurt to go, oh, I realize, your inquiry started here and we're
Mm,
now over here. Did you want to go back there? But always, yeah, frame it as an invitation, and, and allow them that autonomy to go, no, I would much rather be talking or
mm,
doing this now. And, and I work with a lot of PDA clients, and so they might perceive that as a demand if I was to
mm,
say, should we go back here or something. So
mm.
I'm mindful to maybe reflect on where we have been and see, leave that autonomy with them to choose where we might go next. Yeah.
For just side note for people who don't know what PDA is.
Yes, it stands for pathological demand avoidance, which is a profile of autism. I prefer to use persistent drive for autonomy, but again, coming back to language and things, some people say, no, I definitely experienced to be pathological demand avoidance. That suits me, and I respect that's what they have. But, going back to my discomfort around pathologizing people's experience, I prefer to say, persistent drive for autonomy.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great.
Yeah.
That's a great shift. I find also just in general, and this is probably really relevant in terms of moving from a pathologizing point to an understanding point, and I guess in that, if we sort of go with that non-linear fashion that sessions will have with neurodivergent folk, that if we move to a place of understanding and curiosity, sometimes I will actually go, okay, we started here and we've ended up here. How did we get there? Because that gives you so much understanding and context to the person
I
that you're
love that.
sitting with,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I
Yeah.
love that. Yeah. And I think, with PDA, it's always important to give choice and control, but also not feel that they need to pick or
Yeah.
make a choice, I can say, would you like to use any of the art materials on the table? No is fine. Definitely. We can honor that. I've heard of people being kicked out of therapy rooms because they weren't, engaging. And I'm like,
Oh.
I think it's important to just honor that being here is a big thing in itself. Yeah.
On that, for those who are neurodivergent, for those who are queer, maybe that double intersection of both, what are some red flags to look out for in terms of if they are in the room with a therapist and such happens? What are some of those things that they should be aware of that might prompt them to go, maybe I need to find somebody else?
Yeah, I think any sort of questioning around that your experience or why you are the way they are, that you're not just accepting or honoring that, or even what I hear a lot is they hadn't heard of my label and they expected me to teach them. Like, if you're paying for an experience, you don't want to be the one who's taking the role of the teacher in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's okay for therapists to be like, what does that mean to you? Because a lot of these labels do have very broad meanings, but if you're getting a sense that they are trying to use you as a guinea pig to further their knowledge, that's a massive red flag. That shows this person probably hasn't been doing professional development in these areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Or it's just completely unknown to them, which,
Yeah.
if you are somebody who doesn't work with the queer community, that's okay, but it means that you then don't take queer clients because that risks traumatizing their therapeutic experience. There are people who don't work with particular presentations, and it's, working within your scope of practice is not, that's a good thing, obviously, but I guess it goes back to that. I never want my clients to feel like they need to educate me. And that doesn't mean that I sit there thinking that I know everything, because,
No, no.
like you said, I will very often say, what does that term mean for you?
Yeah.
And that's very different to going, what does that mean?
Or
And
even a follow-up question. Someone might go, yeah, what does that term mean to you? And then, yes, they might come in with like, oh, I thought that was another term, or like, you can see, you sense the confusion coming in rather than the acceptance of what you've said. And maybe even there might be a nice warmth that follows that, of acceptance and love to be receiving this part of someone's identity. Yeah.
yeah. what might be some of those internal signs for someone in terms of how they might feel or some of the thoughts that might be going around in their head as to whether this therapist is right for them?
Mm. Well, I think if you're feeling any um, really discomfort in any way, then that yeah, I guess that's a very tough question. Yeah, I'm not sure because you can feel discomfort because it's new, but not necessarily know.
Mm,
Yeah, I guess I would probably wanting to ask the therapist if they have experience with, neurodivergent and queer people, or, I mean,
mm,
honestly, for me, it's so important that my therapists hold one of those identities, or
mm.
yeah, so lived experience is so important to me. So yeah, I probably would be wanting to hear in that first um, session, how have they struggled with being othered? Are they a person of color who's experienced, racism in Australia? Is that how we're going to, move forward and
Mm.
find relationship in knowing that those similar experiences are shared?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I guess on that discomfort, it's distinguishing, is the discomfort around therapy? Because like you said, people can feel discomfort and it can be a new experience, a really different experience, or is the discomfort around the person that you are working with? Because that therapeutic relationship is, as we know, vital and an integral part of whether therapy is beneficial or not. But you probably bring up a good point in terms of ask your therapist questions. We
Yeah,
love them.
that's what I was kind of thinking when you're saying what would those internal thoughts,
Yeah.
red flags be, and I think, yeah, maybe feeling prodded or poked, or
Mm,
um yeah, yeah, you're feeling overwhelmed by questions coming your way, and it doesn't feel like a
mm,
conversation where that person can show that they understand. They don't, understand some people are really uncomfortable with disclosing, like therapists are uncomfortable with disclosing, but yeah, I think there needs to be with this community a level of that to be able to um,
yeah.
yeah, feel comfortable. So yeah,
Hmm.
if you're not feeling that that person in front of you has an understanding or an experience you share, then it's probably going to make you feel othered.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's probably a good point to know that self-disclosure doesn't mean you sitting there and talking about everything that you have done. That's obviously super duper unhelpful for the client. And I will sometimes even um, have offhand comments that display my connection to what they might be talking about in terms of I often will have my dog Naya, who is a cavoodle, in the room.
Oh, cute.
Yeah, and so I will often say something like, talking about her in general chit chat and just saying, she has separation anxiety. She's got to generally be with either myself or my wife.
Mm,
And so that in itself is not, that's not me interrupting their session to disclose something about me or anything like that. But what it does tell them is that I have a wife, which means that I, in some way, shape, or form, without actually verbalizing my sexual identity, fall into the queer community. And so I think it's a good way for therapists who might feel like they don't know where that line is. One, take that to supervision. But
yeah.
two, there is a way that you can do that in general chit chat at the beginning and end of a session that helps that person to settle or to feel that oh, okay, I don't need to filter that part of me. I don't need to be worried about my queerness because I now know that Sam has a wife, right? So
Yeah,
that
exactly.
that can be a
Lovely
really
connection.
simple way.
Mm.
Um,
That actually
but
reminds me, when I was a teenager, my parents made me go see all these therapists, and I hated it. And I had really bad psoriasis all over my hands. It wasn't really
yeah.
something I could hide. And I remember I was sitting with this therapist and she pointed at it and said, "Is that psoriasis?" And I thought, how dare she do that? I was horrified. And then she just lifted up her skirt and her whole legs were covered in it. And then she was
Yeah.
my therapist for years. And that non-verbal moment of,
Mm.
I get it, and we didn't have a lot in common. She was, cisgender, married,
Mm.
kids. She was Sri Lankan though, so we often would talk about feeling othered as a Sri
Mm.
Lankan person in Australia and what that was like for her. And
Yeah.
yeah, I just think back to that moment. She didn't even say, "I have psoriasis too." She just showed it to me. And
Yeah.
at that moment, I was like, "This is my therapist."
Yeah. Absolutely. I
Yeah.
love that. And I guess if we, before we get to the myth, which is always one of my favorite parts of the session, I want to, I guess, reiterate something you said, which is ask your therapist questions even
Mm.
before you get into the room with them.
Oh, before.
If you are on their website and that you have questions popping up automatically, send them an email. I love when people ask questions, particularly specific questions. Have a phone call with them if that's what you would prefer and that's more comfy. And if you are a parent seeking therapy for a child, ask those questions because children and teenagers won't necessarily know those questions to ask, particularly if they are young. And so it's the parent's responsibility to ask those questions for them.
I often do get asked by parents or individuals seeking maybe like an OT or a dietitian or some other support, like how will I know they're affirming? And
Yeah.
I just say like ask them like the things that maybe are you going to make me do something that like this, and see what their response is, because some therapists will be very rigid and be like, if you're not willing to do the work, then I'm not going to take you on. And if that's the kind of attitude, then maybe they're not really you know well educated on
Yeah.
your neurotype and how to best support you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Hit me with what myth we are smashing about this intersection of the community.
Oh, there's so many myths and so many to
Mm.
smash. But yeah, I think one that really stands out to me is in our society, people confuse complex with complicated. And,
Mm-hmm.
I think you don't need to understand a person and all their identities to still
Mm.
respect and even show love towards them.
Absolutely. How do you personally make the distinction between complex and complicated?
Um, Oh, that's a good question. I guess, I see my many identities. I've got so many labels under the queer umbrella. I've got, a multi-neurodivergent individual.
Mm.
And, a lot of those intersections make up a different identity to people who may just have,
Mm.
two labels in those sort of areas. So to a lot of people, when I, talk about myself and my pronouns, I get met with confusion
Mm.
maybe their assumptions are that I'm complicated, disordered, defected, or there's
Mm.
something wrong with me. That people who are simple and easy to understand and relatable are what society wants. And yeah, I just think that's a very boring existence.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, uh, Complex to me is not always it can like complex is not confronting. Complex is exciting. I just
Yeah.
see complex as multifaceted. And I
Mm.
think when we say that something's complicated, we often do use, you know, other terms like confusion and it doesn't really make sense or, that sort of thing. And so using complicated in terms of queerness or neurodivergence, it puts those people back into a box and back into that
Yeah.
pathologizing box, right? Whereas complex just implies that there are different facets of their identity, which is not inherently, well, it doesn't inherently have a moral value
No,
or
absolutely.
anything. They're just different parts of who they are.
we can look up at the stars in the sky and understand that the infinite universe is complex, and yet we stare in awe of it, don't we? But an
Yeah.
individual in front of us that doesn't meet the norms, that maybe they're presenting us with a new label we haven't heard. And yet
Yeah.
I've heard people say, like, I can't keep track of it all. And it's like, you don't have to keep track.
Mm.
That's not anyone's job. You just need to really respect that person who's in front of you. And maybe it's more about getting to know that individual than feeling like, oh, now I'm presented with having to get to know every label or everything in the
Yeah.
community. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, as a queer woman, I don't even know all of the labels in the community, and that's okay because
Yeah.
I don't need to. But and one label doesn't mean the same thing for someone else. Like somebody who presents and says that they are asexual, like there's a lot that falls under that umbrella in itself. And so rather than trying to get bogged down in I need to know all of these terms, maybe just even getting curious about what those terms mean to the person who is sitting in the room with you is a much more understanding approach. What does asexual look like for you? You know, even something like
Really
that.
great. Yeah, it's a really great point. And I guess it brings, we're talking about C words here, like,
Mm,
complex doesn't mean complicated, and
mm.
maybe confusion can equal curiosity instead.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
if you're feeling confused, maybe go, oh, well, let's see if I can shift that to being curious, rather than shutting that down and feeling like it's out of your realm or too complicated to sit with.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that. And I think that that's probably a really simple way for new therapists to go, how do I respond if somebody in the room presents with something that I actually don't know about? And to take a stance of curiosity, of I wonder what that's like for the person who is in the room, as opposed to I wonder what I would read about that if I read about it in a book. And it not be about, oh shit, I don't know what that is. It just be about curiosity of what that is like for the person in the room.
I
So
think it makes me
yeah.
want to jump back to something you said earlier in the typical neurodivergent non-linear pattern.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think too, if a therapist, you're talking about referring on, if you
Mm,
don't have that
yeah.
knowledge. I think not enough people are trained to know how to do that properly. Like, I've had
Mm,
psychologists call me and go, oh, my client's just come out as gay, and I don't work with those people.
mm,
And then, I met with this individual, and it's, done in that handover was done in a very shameful way. And I'm like, it's
mm,
okay to come in and go, this is not my area. I would love to get you someone that maybe has the lived experience, the knowledge, so that, we can support you. You don't have to go, I don't deal with gay issues, or even
mm,
framing it issues. I hear that so often. Like, you see that on directories and stuff, and they're like,
mm,
LGBTQIA plus issues. And
yeah.
that's pathologizing to call it that.
Mm,
I feel like it's affirming care that
yeah.
we do. Yeah.
Absolutely. I would agree. I mean, even as you said, a psychologist will call or anyone will call and say, I don't work with those people, like those people,
Yeah,
even
those people. Yeah,
like
yeah.
that term. And I think I think this is probably a really great point to sort of end on. If you have people who are queer or neurodivergent coming to your space, whether it be a virtual or physical room, and that's not your area of expertise or it is outside your scope of practice, to seek supervision, not just around how you get care and support for the person who is in your room, but also to maybe reflect on your own bias and your own internal conversation that happens of why do I feel like I automatically need to refer somebody who tells me they're gay or who tells me they have ADHD or something like that? What is that about for me? And get curious about it for yourself as well in supervision. What is that about? Because that will inherently, even if you still choose not to work with those people for whatever reason, you exclusively work with men or whatever, and a woman presents, but
Or someone comes out as a woman, I think that's
yes,
the big thing. I
yeah,
hear people go, I would never work with
exactly.
trans people. I'm like, I don't think you can actually control that. Someone might not disclose that to you
No,
one day. And the best thing you
exactly.
can do is learn how to do that handover very delicately and
Mm.
respectfully, if you feel, yeah, you're a fish out of water there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think, and being curious and exploring why that comes up for you is going to naturally mean that the way that you do refer clients who are out of your scope of practice is going to be a much more trauma-informed and gentle process for them.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
I feel very fortunate, like when um, my supervisees have reached out to me and am asking questions about what they're looking for, and they say that they're looking for someone in this space that has the lived experience because they recognize they don't. And I'm like,
Mm.
I think that's really important supervision too, is, if someone's a, cisgendered therapist and they're saying they're going to help you do trans affirming care,
Mm.
there's going to be a lot of gaps in their knowledge. I'm sure they're really well-meaning and stuff, but they might even tell you to put preferred pronouns on your intake form because they don't have the lived
Mm.
experience of going, I hate the word preferred, or, and so I think it's good to really seek out people, whatever type of supervision you are, that
Mm.
are in that community or have that lived experience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think that's a really, really great point to end on, not just for other therapists, but for people who are seeking therapy for those things to be aware of as well. In terms of, the care and the support that you receive from the people who are sitting in our position as a therapist. And and on that note, thank you.
Thank you.
It has been so good. I love having these conversations. I love talking about things that, really, as much as I love the modality conversations, I really love the people conversations because they're the people who are in our room. And as much as the modality is really wonderful, it is, therapy is in itself human to human interaction. And so I think when we can bring the conversation back to who is in the room with us, not how were we working with them in the room, um, it is always just a super, super productive and helpful conversation for people, and hopefully has provided many, many questions for people to explore and thoughts in the way that they work as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed joining us inside the therapy room. Thanks for listening.